Welcome to another edition of Education Matters, a program where we discuss education issues in New Jersey. I'm Ray Pinney. I'll be your host. Today we'll be talking about HIB in New Jersey. I think it's an issue that a lot of board members and administrators grapple with. With me is David Nash from FEA, which we'll explain in a little bit. And we'll have a conversation on that. And just one more thing, if you like this podcast, you want to see it again, just subscribe. It's at the bottom. And we'll be having another one next month. So, David, welcome. How are you?
Great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So, just explain who you are with the FEA and how it relates to NJSBA.
Sure. I'm a Director of Legal Education and National Outreach for the Foundation for Educational Administration. A lot of folks would know me as the person who oversees the Legal One program. We do school law training for really everyone involved in our schools. From board members to parents and teachers and, of course, school principals. We are constantly working on a wide range of legal issues and trying to educate everybody. But the issue that we get asked about more than anything is harassment, intimidation, and bullying. The work that I do is affiliated with the New Jersey Principals and Supervisors Association. That is, we're kind of the professional development arm of New Jersey Principals and Supervisors. And it's really wonderful being in this role. Before I was here, I served many years as legal counsel representing school administrators when legal issues came up. It's better sometimes to help people before they're in trouble. So we started Legal One.
Great. And I've seen you speak on the HIB, harassment, intimidation, and bullying. So I know you're well versed in this issue. But let's get, I think what I hear the most, one of the things is, what is bullying? Is it what, because people, yes. I think they all have their own personal idea of what bullying is, but let's look at the law.
Yes. And of course, it can feel like a very personal issue. If you've experienced it in some way yourself, there can be a visceral reaction to the concept. So bullying is very specifically defined in New Jersey. And actually, you see a specific definition for harassment, intimidation, or bullying. It's all considered one thing. So you do have to have certain elements in New Jersey to have bullying. You need to have a student who's a victim, who has been singled out because of some particular characteristic, either an actual or perceived characteristic about that student. Could be something like race, ethnicity, gender, religion, disability, student who's perceived as overweight, new kid in the school. But you need some characteristic. You need to have a substantial disruption for that student. So something that's interfering with their ability to be in school and function well. You need specific harm. It could be physical harm. It could be emotional harm. It could be fear. It can be something that makes the student feel demeaned because of who they are or a group they're part of, or something that creates a hostile educational environment so the student isn't able to function well in school. So you really have to make sure that we have all those elements. And we do have, of course, some, concerning behavior that might not meet that technical definition, but is still something important that school districts would address, even if it's not HIB.
Let me just re-emphasize that. So there could be an incident. It may not be bullying, but what you're saying is it still means it wasn't correct. And
Sure.
So I think there's you and I were talking about this. Sometimes people say if it's not declared bullying, then they're innocent. No, we're just talking that there might be a conflict. There might be a different type of way to address it.
Of course. I mean, simple example, two students are out on the playground. They're having a disagreement and one student hits the other. Clearly, that's a violation of the Code of Student Conduct. It's an issue the district would take seriously and address. We don't know yet whether that would be bullying. Was the student singled out because of some particular characteristic? Did this cause substantial disruption or harm for the student? So there's more to the analysis to figure out whether it's bullying, but you already know it's unacceptable conduct.
Okay. And for those watching this on their Facebook or YouTube, if you have a question, you can put it in the chat room and I'll relay it on. One of my questions would be, and I get this often, is can a staff member be accused of bullying?
We do see that. Generally, you're looking at students who are the alleged aggressors in these situations, but we have seen, all levels of staff, from aides to teachers to counselors to administrators. Technically, even a board member could fall under someone who's accused of bullying. So in those situations, some additional considerations come into play about how you do the investigation. So, for example, if a teacher was accused of bullying, you wouldn't want to have an anti-bullying specialist who is in the same bargaining unit
Okay.
doing that investigation. So there's some different process that we have to think about, but certainly you could have a staff member accused of bullying.
And a staff member just cannot accuse a student of bullying them, can they?
That's right. And we get that question a lot, right? What if the staff member feels bullied by one of their students? There are other rules for that. School districts have a code of conduct for students. You're supposed to be respectful to to the staff members that you're dealing with. You're not supposed to threaten them. You're not supposed to do things to disrupt the classroom. So, we have other rules for that, but it wouldn't fall under our bullying law.
Okay. I guess we have a theme here that just because it's not bullying,
That's right.
there are other ways to address issues.
Absolutely.
The other thing is, what are the parents' right, and both sides, if their son or daughter is accused of bullying, or if their student, their son or daughter is bullied?
Sure. So great question. And the rights are pretty extensive for parents. First, parents have a right to know that their child either may have been targeted for bullying or has been accused of engaging in bullying behavior. So notice that there is an allegation and that there will be an investigation is kind of the first right. Parents have a right, if they disagree with the outcome of the investigation, to ask for a hearing before the Board of Education. That would be in closed session. Of course, you don't want the world having to listen to very sensitive information, but in closed session, they could, indicate to the Board of Ed why they disagree with the outcome of that investigation. In every case, the Board of Education is charged with voting to either affirm the results of the investigation, modify, or reject the results of that investigation. So that happens in every case. Parents would also have appeal rights beyond that. If they disagreed with the outcome, they could appeal to the Commissioner of Education. If they disagreed with the commissioner, they could appeal in state court. If they felt their child was the victim of discrimination, they would have other options under state and federal law to potentially bring a discrimination claim. So there's, very extensive rights. One right that a parent doesn't have, and sometimes, this can be a sensitive topic, school districts do have a right to interview kids without parent permission, without parents being present, without parents having to approve who the interviewer is. And that's, for good common sense reasons. If you're trying to figure out what happened in any sort of an incident in school, sometimes you need to work quickly. Mm-hmm. So the U.S. Supreme Court 50 years ago, in a case called Goss v. Lopez, made clear that school officials have the right to interview kids, have the right to try to determine what happened and reach conclusions without having to have parent permission to do that, or schools couldn't really function.
Can they, if you have a punishment for someone who is a bullier, do they get the victim's parents, do they get to know what that punishment was?
Yeah, and they don't, and that can be frustrating. So we have federal law that comes into play here, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, which, places some pretty strong confidentiality limits on what school districts can share. So parents would have a right to know that their child was the victim of bullying, if that's the finding. They would have a right to know that discipline was imposed as per the Code of Student Conduct. But generally speaking, they don't have the right to know the specifics. Now, I say generally because sometimes they have to know. For example, if one of the responses is that the students cannot sit next to each other, cannot, play together or work together, it's important for both parents to understand that, mm-hmm. and for the students directly to understand that. So you can run into some particular circumstances where the parent needs to know some information, but generally they're not going to find out exactly what the discipline was.
I guess that's because generally student things are private. We can't.
That's right.
We can't talk about, boards can't talk about students by name. They usually have numbers and of that sort. And I think we have to communicate that to the parents sometimes.
Yes, and I think one way to get parents to understand that, if their child was accused of something, right, and kids make mistakes, there are learning opportunities. The parent wouldn't want the world to know, all of the details of that situation or exactly what discipline was imposed on their child. So, the district is just trying to honor that for all students, to try to do everything they can to protect their confidentiality.
Uh, a lot of this HIB law is based on LAD, the Law Against Discrimination, which is a New Jersey law. And I think that's important to emphasize that this New Jersey law is kind of defines what are some of the groups that are protected.
Yeah, it's a really important point. New Jersey has one of the strongest anti-discrimination laws in the country. So in places of public accommodation, of course, which include public schools, we have to make sure that students are not discriminated against based on factors like race, ethnicity, gender, religion, disability, sexual orientation, gender identity. So we have a very comprehensive law, and some bullying obviously is going to meet the standard of also being discrimination under the law against discrimination. So it's two separate laws. You can have bullying that's not because of a protected class. You know, the student is perceived as being overweight, for example, or the student is targeted because they're new to the school. But about half the bullying we see statewide is because of a protected class, something that's also covered under the law against discrimination.
And I think that's important to note, particularly in this time frame in our country, that I think it's something that we have to be aware of, particularly that this is a New Jersey law that is.
Yes. So New Jersey has very specific law in place, and a lot of things are happening at the federal level, and there's all sorts of shifting federal priorities when it comes to education policy and law in a variety of areas. But education is primarily a state responsibility, and we have very particular New Jersey laws on education and New Jersey specific laws when it comes to discrimination protection, and those are clearly still in effect. One of the things that we do have to keep in mind is that you can have a student who's targeted because of a characteristic, and it could be what's called a bias-related act. Student is singled out because of race, ethnicity, gender, religion, disability. That's also something that we have to report to local law enforcement and to a county prosecutor's office. So it is important to recognize that sometimes school districts have an obligation to go beyond the HIB investigation and at least notify those other levels because of an issue that law enforcement may choose to investigate to see if there are potential hate crimes that could be involved as well.
Okay, let's get into what the role of the board is. Because they get all the reports from the administration. So what's the role of the Board of Education in all this?
Yeah, I have to say I very much appreciate how hard that role is. It feels like a prior life, but I spent 6 years as a school board member. And I know how difficult it is trying to look at individual student issues like this as a board member. So the board's role, it has many aspects to it. The Board of Education, of course, adopts policy. So every district has to have a policy that addresses how you deal with harassment, intimidation, and bullying. And there are related policies for anti-discrimination, for example, that boards have to adopt. The board has to make sure that in approving the budget, there are resources so that staff members are properly trained. The board needs to make sure that appropriate personnel are in place. So every school has to have an anti-bullying specialist that leads the investigations and leads a school climate team. And you need an anti-bullying coordinator for the district. So those things have to be in place. And the Board of Education also has to vote on every single investigation. A report is produced by an anti-bullying specialist. The results of that investigation are communicated by the superintendent to the Board of Ed. And the board is ultimately asked to vote to affirm, reject, or modify the conclusion in every one of those cases. And as I mentioned, sometimes a parent disagrees. Sometimes a parent asks for a hearing before the board. And if they ask for it, we have to give it within 10 days.
Do they have to give a reason why they would vote no against the recommendation of the administration?
It's a great question, right? If the board disagrees with the outcome and votes to overturn or modify that outcome, that now is the legal position of the school district on that issue. And of course, a parent on the other side might disagree with that conclusion and challenge it. So you want to, as a board, be able to articulate what are the specific legal reasons that support a different conclusion than the one that was reached in the investigation. Because if there is a challenge down the road, the district has to be prepared to defend the new conclusion that they've reached.
One of the things that I've heard from board members where they have difficulty on this, and I think sometimes administrators do, is the age of the student.
Yes.
There's a couple ways I can go on this one, but one of them is that they're 7 years old.
Yeah.
Is there really intent? So is age taken into account by the district?
It is, and it's a really important thing to consider. It's very difficult for a kindergartner or first grader to bully, because one of the pieces that we think about is what would we expect a student to know and understand at that age? And we expect students, not to quite understand as much about the impact of their actions when they're 6 compared to when they're 16. So age is a relevant factor that goes into the analysis, but we have seen confirmed bullying cases for very young kids. So we do expect kids to understand some things when they're 6 or 7 or 8 years old. And certainly if you take the time after there has been an incident to explain the harm and then the student continues the behavior, we have seen a number of those cases where it was found to be bullying because, student is told what you're doing is causing harm. If they choose to keep doing it, now there's an expectation that, well, there could be a consequence.
And what I've heard from some people is like, maybe they're a little older, they're 10 or 11, and they're declared a bully. Does that go on their transcripts forever and they won't get into a college or something like that?
That's a huge concern. It's probably the biggest concern that we hear from parents on this issue. So first, colleges will never have a right to know about issues that happened, K through 8, kindergarten through 8th grade. And even at the high school level, if colleges are asking for that information, a parent has a right to decide they're not going to share that information with a college. So even at the high school level, the parent has control. The question can't even be asked when it comes to issues prior to high school.
One of the things that we've learned, I think, over the course of time is HIB connection to mental health.
Yes.
In the school environment. And I mean, for everyone, not just the victim. Can you explain the connection that we've seen over the years?
Yeah, and it can be devastating. So, one of the horrific things that we never want to deal with as a student thinking about suicide, thinking about that horrific decision. Part of the research that we've seen, I'll give you one example from the Cyberbullying Research Center, national research organization, showed that if students are bullied in person and online, the risk of that student thinking about suicide increases almost 800%.
Wow.
Compared to students who are not bullied at all. So there's no absolute predictor. There is no crystal ball that says, when a student might engage in those thoughts, but the risk skyrockets. And I think part of it is when they're bullied both in person and online, the student doesn't feel like they can escape it. I mean, I sort of learned a long time ago that the advice that, well, just don't look online doesn't work. It kind of goes against the hard wiring of our brains. People want to look, kids and adults. So when we have students who are bullied online, we really do need to be proactive in checking in with those students, assessing their well-being. If the student's struggling, they might not choose to come forward and ask for help. It's really on us as the adults to make sure that we're providing a safe, supportive environment and letting that student know there are adults who care and that we do have their back and we are going to be checking in on them.
So if you're a school principal, teacher, whatever in a school, you probably should check in on some kids who've been bullied to see if there's anything going on online. And where's the school district's role? I mean, can they look at that in their decision making?
Yeah, I think it's very important for school districts to always keep in mind, checking on the mental health of students and figuring out who the adults are who have the best connection to that student. So, for many students, that person is a school counselor. For some students, it's a school administrator or a particular teacher. For some students, it's a coach who knows that student better than anybody else. For some students, it's somebody who works in the main office who just has developed a real bond or connection with a certain student. So you don't have to be an expert on mental health to be the important adult connection for that student. And you really want to think through for that child, who is the person who knows them best, who will notice if there's a change in their baseline demeanor, that's something you're looking for. The student has always been outgoing and friendly. Now they're shutting down. Now they're quiet. Or maybe now they're being aggressive where they never were before. So those changes that you might not think are such a big deal, it's really important to communicate that early on so the district can intervene.
I don't know, it may not be, it's counterintuitive, but what about the person who's the bully? They might have some mental health issues too. Do we do a follow-up with them?
It's equally important to think about all students involved in these issues. The last thing you want to do is forget about the student who engaged in the bullying behavior. In many cases, that's its own cry for help. And that student could be somebody who is struggling with a whole range of issues that are leading that student to make this type of a choice. And, one of the phrases that I often hear is that hurt people, right? So students who have experienced some sort of trauma or harm themselves often don't know how to process those issues and end up doing something harmful to another student. So it's very important that we're checking in and that we're not demonizing the student. You're not a bully. You're a student who engaged in bullying behavior. This doesn't define who you are. It's something that happened, and it can be a teachable moment going forward.
You touched on the cyberbullying a little bit.
Yeah.
When the law was first passed, actually it goes back, I think 2002 when we first had, but our technology and our world is changing much fast, and social media is not where it was even 5 or 6 years ago, and we have AI.
Yes.
How do districts deal with that? Because that could bring a different type of bullying.
It can. Artificial intelligence has all this incredible potential, and it's being used already in amazing ways to support students and to broaden educational opportunities. But of course, any new technology can be used for good purposes and for purposes that are not so good. So we have seen, for example, deep fakes, where some students who are pretty sophisticated with technology have figured out how to use artificial intelligence to create fake images of other students and to put them in demeaning or inappropriate videos and share them out to the world. There was a horrific case where a group of boys in a high school in New Jersey used artificial intelligence to create fake sexually explicit images of female students and shared them. And you can imagine how devastating that would be for the students involved. So that's an example of something that is sexual harassment, would be harassment, intimidation, or bullying, but goes far beyond that. And now we're talking about potential crimes under state and federal law. And law enforcement really is signaling that they will treat those deep fake images that are created through AI as if they were authentic images. And there is real potential for criminal prosecution in those cases.
That might be something that we should, and this is probably older students, but we should be stressing to students that some of these things that they might think is not that serious has very serious consequences.
Yes.
Legally.
That's right. And school districts do have an obligation to address digital citizenship. It's part of the curriculum requirement that we have to address. So for students, even at very young ages, we want to start talking about these issues, responsible uses of technology, and how easily we can cause harm. Students in their developing brains don't always fully understand the impact of what they're saying or doing and the harm that they could be causing to others. So taking the time to help students develop empathy, develop understanding about how harmful some of these things are. You do something in an instant with technology, and it can be out there forever for the world to see.
Okay. Any final thoughts you have on what, particularly for a board member, maybe what questions they should ask if they want to get to know what their program is like?
I think it's really important for board members to understand how extensive this process is and the significant level of training that should be provided for staff members. So, one good set of questions for board members to ask: are we training all of our staff members to understand the signs of potential harassment, intimidation, and bullying? Are we making sure that everybody understands the importance of school climate? That doesn't get the attention it deserves, the school climate piece, because we're thinking about specific incidents and responding after the fact. But to me, probably the most important role for a board is asking, what can we do to help support a safe, supportive climate for everybody in our schools. The better that climate is, the less we have to respond to incidents on the
So
back end.
it's kind of being proactive and not being reactive to incidents and trying to create that climate where those incidents may not occur or they're very rare.
Yeah, and I think there's a landmark case that I think every board member should know about, LW versus Tom's River. It was a really important case from 2007 decided by the New Jersey Supreme Court. It involved a student who had been singled out starting at the elementary level because of perceived sexual orientation, and he was bullied by a large number of kids. It continued into middle school. It continued into high school. The district, whenever they found out about an incident, would impose discipline on the students who engaged in the bullying behavior. But the behavior continued, it escalated, it became more physical in nature. And ultimately, the parents said, I don't think you can keep my child safe. Removed the child from the district, sued the school district, and the New Jersey Supreme Court really raised the bar in this case. What the court said was it's not enough to impose discipline after the fact. If that's not working, you need to step back and look in a more comprehensive way at every aspect of your operations. Look at your school climate, look at the training for staff, look at the way you monitor different areas in the school where things are more likely to happen. Things are much less likely to happen in a classroom than in a hallway or on a playground or at recess or on the bus when it's less structured. So thinking through all of those issues proactively as opposed to just relying on punishment after the fact. And I think, getting boards to ask those questions, what are we doing to be proactive on these issues is really critical.
Yeah, that's a great point, and it's probably being proactive, not just on this, any issue
That's right.
is probably a good rule of thumb.
Yes.
So Dave, I'd like to thank you for joining us. I think anyone who, particularly if you're a new board member, you get a lot out of that basic idea about what HIB is and is not. So that brings us to the end of this Education Matters episode. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in our next episode.